to our next flip video. This is going to be the first flip video of our new unit about the Renaissance. So we actually have two separate essential questions for this video. So for the purposes of just logistics, you may label this as video lesson 5.1. And then I'm going to give you the essential questions. There will be two throughout the video. So first, let's start off with what characteristics differentiate... Actually, I'm sorry. That's not the one I want. This one here. So go ahead and start with this essential question. What were the defining political changes that European society experienced during the High Middle Ages? So we're going to start off talking about politics. So to get us started, the political changes of what's known as the High Middle Ages, the late Middle Age period, which occurred from approximately 1200 to 1400. Some people expand that back to about 1000, all the way through 1400. So generally speaking, what are the characteristics of this late period? And we're going to trace this because the evolution of the political system throughout the Renaissance is going to be something that we'll loop back to at the end of the unit. After the decline of feudalism, we saw the kings were centralizing their power, specifically places like France, England, and Spain. We start to see the rise of strong monarchies again, and well, I shouldn't say again, but the rise of these strong monarchies. In many ways, this is the beginning of what you and I think of as modern-day countries. We start to see, once you think about people almost picking up their heads, literally picking up their heads and looking around the manor and starting to align culturally and politically with the people around them, so much so that we're starting to get the creation of what are known as nation states or countries. There was, however, resistance to this monarch's power, and specifically, pretty logically, the nobility felt threatened by these rising kings and these increasingly powerful kings. An example of that is actually one of the most famous documents in human history, which is known as the Magna Carta. This was signed in 1215 in England. People often cite this as the origins of our modern government because this was the first time that a king willingly gave up power. And he wasn't, and by willingly, that doesn't mean he wanted to, but he actually agreed to. So King John was forced to sign this Magna Carta, which empowered the nobles, and it really placed unprecedented, never before seen limitations on the king's power. This is far cry from the modern democracy, but it certainly marks a significant change in the idea that a king's power could potentially be limited. Now, this was really, really far from widespread. This is just an example, an early example of our modern political system's evolutions, but for the most part, we see these really strong kings who have absolute rule. The strongest monarchies during the High Middle Ages were really in France and in England, and what has defined much of the French and British history is competition and conflict between these two very strong powers. For example, a not exactly 100 years, but somewhere close to, the Hundred Years' War that occurred from 1337 to 1453. France and England were in competition for both land and power. And this consistent and pretty much constant conflict left both areas, specifically though England, in tremendous debt. And Edward III even gives up some of his power in exchange for the right for Parliament. And Parliament, of course, is the body that makes laws, much like our U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. So the Parliament is going to actually levy taxes so that England doesn't go under during this difficult period. So we start to see some shifts here. There were other places where there were not particularly well-organized monarchies. For example, the area that was formerly under Charlemagne, known as the Holy Roman Empire, was very loosely organized into what ultimately, after a long period of time, became Germany. Other poorly, or I should say loosely organized monarchies was Italy. And Italy was organized into these basically, the Papal States were independent. But the Papal States, which I mentioned earlier in the year, or in the former unit, I should say, when Pope Gregory established these as his own individual government units. So we've got the Duchy of Milan, we've got the Republic of Florence, there's several others, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Sicily. Very blurry map there, I apologize for that, but just even from the colors you can see this loose organization of these regions. We're coming right back to this because Italy is going to be the area that experiences this new cultural revival, and we're going to see how that influences the relationships between these different regions. So we see one of the defining features and the political changes of this High Middle Age period is the decline of the church. So the papal claims of supremacy over the monarchs, so the popes claim that they have more power than the monarchs, was increasingly out of touch with the fact that the kings are rising in power. So the papal claim of supremacy doesn't seem to jive and no longer seems accurate in relation to this rising power of the kings. Now, this played out in a very specific and measurable way in what's known as the Great Schism. So here's the background. The EG means, for example, King Philip IV of France claimed the right to tax the clergy, meaning the people who worked for the church. Well, the Pope at the time, a man named Pope Boniface VIII, said that there's no way that was going to happen without his agreement, without his consent. So we see this immediate conflict. Well, then the Pope dies, and the king gets the cardinal, so the man who's just below the Pope, one of the men just below the Pope, to elect a French Pope. Now, this is crazy because up until this point, the Pope has been exclusively in Rome. Remember, there was that biblical passage that said that the Pope had to come from Rome. He was the Christ's visceral or representative on earth. So all of a sudden, we have a king who's starting to get involved in the organization of the church. So now all of a sudden, with this French Pope, okay, and this actually skipped right to the second bullet point there, this leads to what's known as the Great Schism. This is a period of time. Let's just clean this up a little bit here. This is the period of time where there are actually competing popes in France and Italy. So we have a period of two popes. And there's actually a great graphic I have somewhere in here. There it is, that bottom right there. We see that the pope is, there we have one pope in France in a place called Avignon and one pope in Rome. So this is pretty crazy. Both of the popes want, there we are. Competing popes in the France and Italy. As I just mentioned, Pope Philip IV of France claims the right. Boniface dies. It doesn't work. And the king gets the cardinal to elect a French pope who's in Avignon, France. So no need to recopy anything on there. Here's the papacy. So you can see this new, I mean, for all intents and purposes, is a castle where the Pope lived in Avignon, France, as opposed to in the Vatican in Rome. So two competing popes. Well, that makes, in this great schism, both popes wanted support from the kings. Here's a map to show you. The regions of Europe are torn between which one of these popes that they're actually agreeing to. Do they have allegiance to Rome, or do they have allegiance to the purple there, which is going to be the Pope in France? Both popes are competing for the support from the king so that they could validate the claim, so they could be the ones who said, I am the true pope. Therefore, this is key. The Pope starts to change both popes change the policies of the church to align with the policies of their supporting kings. For example, France, Spain, Scotland, and southern Italy were supporting the French Pope in Avignon. England, Germany, Scandinavia, and Italy are supporting the Roman Pope. So the end game and the star that should appear in your notes here, the result of this, is that the kings are now becoming more powerful than the popes. That's not to say that the popes are all of a sudden going to be irrelevant, but we're starting to see this division here with the kings taking on significantly more power and significant more influence in the centralization of the power. So the fact that the popes needed support from the kings meant that the policies are now going to align with the church is aligning with the kings as opposed to vice versa. So what this really laid the groundwork for is in the emergence of European nation states. All of these changes mean that we no longer have these feudal, manneralistic governments and societies, but instead we're starting to see countries start to unify. So these nation states are these countries that are unified by a common culture. This also is laying the groundwork for what's really going to define most of the 1700s is these absolute rulers where they have unchallenged power. For example, how this actually happened. The French monarchy, Louis IX, actually taxed his nobility so that he could really continue to secure his power. In the English monarchies, something you may have heard of before, we have the Tudor dynasties with Henry VII, and that's going to come back in a little bit. We see that there's the unification of Spain in the bottom left there, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon, the region in the top right, in the grayish color, and Isabella of Castile, unified that entire peninsula together of Spain, and it secured their power over the popes, together secured power over the other regions, and this ended the Muslim kingdom that was still left in Granada, because you remember here that this Spanish region used to be Muslim. It used to be part of the Muslim Empire. The people who lived there were known as Moors. So we see this is really the unification of what is soon to become modern-day Spain, and we see that there is also the emergence, we'll pause there for a minute, also the emergence here ending of strong Muslim presence in Europe. Okay, so the next piece of what emerges out of all of these changes, so we've seen the decline of the papal authority. We see the rise here of the period that's known as the Renaissance. So Renaissance is literally Renaissance, which means rebirth in French. And this is the term that's used to describe the period of Italian history, specifically Italian history, from 1350 to 1550 CE. Now, the Renaissance is going to spread to other areas of European society as well. We're going to see an emergence of what's known as the Northern Renaissance. But this period is such a critical period of cultural and social shifts in European society. What it's defined as, or defined by, we see the revival of classical antiquity. Now, antiquity is a term we learned a long time ago, but antiquity is the ancient past, specifically Greece and Rome. So we see a revival of this classic period of European history. People are starting to portray this art from this period. They're going back to the scholarship of this period, the political thoughts, the arts, the literature. But I'm going to plant a seed here, is that Europeans would say it's a revival of their own past. But we're going to start to question, was this a uniquely European experience, or does credit for this movement really belong to the Muslim world? Because it was from the Muslim world that Europeans learned about their own past. It was the Byzantines, those crusaders, who were interacting with the Byzantine world, who brought us these scholarship. So, as we mentioned already, so these Muslim scholars, the Byzantines that were maintaining much of the work that was from ancient Greece and Rome. And it was the Muslim scholars that these Byzantines and that these Europeans were interacting with through the Crusades. Those Muslim scholars were the ones who really translated much of this ancient work. So that fast forward here now, from all the way up to 1350, the now Europeans, specifically the Italians, can now look at these works from their own ancient past, and they're now starting to be revived as a result of their connections with the Byzantines and the Muslims through the Crusades. So it's a very interesting situation. It's much like if a foreign country came in and helped Americans understand our own ancient past. It's a very interesting concept. But nonetheless, this period is defined of a revival of classical antiquity. Two other key pieces. We see this revival, and I do mean revival because it's not entirely new. Ancient Greece and Rome had some of these characteristics. The revival of secularism. Secularism is when things are worldly, not religious. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anti-religion. That's important. But worldly, and focusing on the human existence in the human world, and not just looking towards religious figures and religious significance. We also see a revival of the concept of individuality, just valuing human beings and their individual worth. I'm sorry, got track practice outside here. So why Italy? Why did this revival and this process happen specifically in Italy? First reason is because is an economic one. The Italian merchants that were present in Italy were benefiting from the Crusades trade. Specifically, the group of people that benefited the most were the Venetians, the people from, you scroll back in your slides, you can see the Republic of Venice at the time. So we see the Venetians are benefiting from that trade, and the picture that's at the right there is a picture I took in Florence. Florence was really the heart of this Italian Renaissance, and so much of the artistic movement that came from there. When Italian merchants, they became, visual specifics there, they were producing luxuries like silk and glasswork and metalworking and precious stones and printing and manufacturing. Many of the trades that had sort of been lost in the feudal world that the Italian merchants are really starting to revive and to thrive in. And also, logically, when you have the money from the trade and you have the money from these merchant and these business enterprises, well, then you have the money to invest in art and you have the money to invest in intellectual pursuits. We saw the rise of banking, specifically the house in Florence. There's the Medici family. Was the family that's really became almost like they've been compared in many ways. They're sort of an oligarchy. There's just incredibly famous family of the Medicis, and the house of the Medicis is the name of the bank. They became the greatest bank all throughout Europe, and this group, this family, just became incredibly powerful and wealthy and influential in many ways in Florence during the Renaissance. Just some other pictures so you can see what modern day Florence looks like. You can see that picture there is of the Duomo, which is a very famous art museum that houses much of the art, some that you actually looked at in class, of this really fantastic artwork, sort of a cultural center. And this is a picture of the Medici's house, this really famous, powerful family during the Renaissance in Florence. This one I did not take, but this is just the house and their palace, really, that was there. And I'm going to skip here for 1 second, coming back. What all of this intellectual movement and a lot of these changes were really defined by is the rise of an intellectual movement and literary movement known as humanism. And just like the term itself has the connotation of, humanism was all about appreciating, valuing, and understanding human dignity and human worth. Now, a lot of people pitch this as being, again, anti-religious, and that's really not the case. It's really coexisting with religion and saying the religious and the afterworld and the power of God is all present, but we must too also appreciate our human existence and our individuality and our ability to really better the world around us. So we really see that there's something called civic humanism, where humanists are really starting to see how they themselves can improve their society and improve the government they're existing in. So humanism and secularism and individuality and the revival of the classical ancient Greece and Rome, all of these are really true defining characteristics of this intellectual and social movement known as the Renaissance. The picture at the bottom right is, for example, a way that humanism would be represented, because that's actually Leonardo da Vinci's work. And really understanding how to portray the human body and human movements and the appreciation of the human body is really manifested in all the works of art that come out of this time period. We already saw this too, that the Petrarch and the humanists, the people who followed this line of thinking, really focused, as I already mentioned, on reviving Greek and Roman studies of things like grammar, rhetoric, which means the way you speak, poetry, philosophy. And we really see a rise in secular writing, non-religious writing. So this is sort of a branch. We had the Benedictine monasteries. We did have the opening of some very early universities through the church. But we're really starting to see a break and seeing a lot of academic scholarship in European society that had been gone for a long time. And we saw this through secular writing, and this is really where Shakespeare emerges. So we see literature emerging that is not necessarily religious in nature. Petrarch is also famous because he's the one who actually called or coined the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. He really defined the early Middle Ages as this definitively bad period of time. That's where we get the Dark Ages. But as we've learned, it wasn't all dark. It wasn't that those universities were still in existence. But he really defined this Renaissance and this rebirth and this rise of humanism as a period of positive change. Okay, oh wait, I skipped that one. Here we go, almost there. One thing, a seed I want to plant here is the reorganization of social classes in this new period of European history. Since feudalism has fallen, we no longer have those rigid we no longer have those really those vassalage relationships, but we still do have some pretty strong and clearly defined social roles. So what really remains in the remnants of feudal society is that we have a first estate, and the first estate is the first class, the highest class. We're going to made up of the clergy, the people of the church. And they really were, they still had a role in the government. They were exempt from certain taxes. They really still had a privileged position. The second estate were still the nobility, the people of a higher class. And the third estate is the peasants and everybody else. So we still have a clearly socially defined society, but in one that isn't necessarily defined by those vassalage relationships of military service and loyalty that once were. So there it is. And there are your analysis questions. Please go ahead and complete each one of these in your own words, and I will see you in class.